A boy filled with curiosity grows up to be a scientist.
The wonder of discovering what the world is about, this is as good as it gets.
Stephen Chu becomes famous for making groundbreaking advances in science. But at the height of his career, he walks away from his lab to take on the crisis facing us all: climate change.
I began to think, as a citizen who's also a scientist, what could I do to help?
When he's at home here in Northern California, Stephen Chu likes to cook. But his culinary skills are not the reason he's known all over the world. Steve is one of America's leading scientists. And for more than 2 decades, he's been urging us to use science to cope with the problems posed by climate change.
You ask what's the biggest problem in climate change, whether it's sea level rise, or droughts, or forest fires, or heat waves, I would turn the question around and say, no, the biggest problem is to deny that it's happening and to say that the risks aren't really real.
Today, Steve travels the world talking about climate. But being a public figure was something he never imagined when he began his journey in science. It's the 1950s, and Steve and his family live in Garden City, Long Island, just outside New York City. As a kid, he's fascinated by how things work. He builds mechanical devices and elaborate machines, and launches model rockets. But in the Chu family, science is seen as something much more serious. Steve's father teaches chemical engineering at a college in Brooklyn. Both his father and mother were born in China. They met in college and decided to go to graduate school in the US, where they got married. Growing up, Steve and his brothers, Gilbert and Morgan, are told that their relatives include the most famous female chemist in China, a well-known engineer, and an eminent physicist, and that he and his brothers are expected to uphold the family tradition.
When I look back on my life and think about it coming from an academic family, both sides of the family, mother's and father's side, you could say I had no choice. There was no option. Everybody gets a PhD.
In high school, Steve earns an A- average, which in his family is not good enough. He is expected to do just as well as his older brother Gilbert, who racked up the highest grade point average in the history of Garden City High School.
The pressure could have been overwhelming. I could have said, forget this. I'm going to be a bum. I'm going to be a rebel. I was a rebel. I was fed up with being compared with my older brother and my cousins. So I dropped out of high school, but it was only 3 months. I went back and took the final exams. It could have gone differently. I was the first male child not to go to Harvard or Princeton. That's how bad I was.
Instead, Steve goes to the University of Rochester, where no one knows his brother. He signs up for a course in physics, then takes another and another. He thinks he's found his calling. He goes to grad school and becomes a physicist. Then, Steve lands a job at the legendary Bell Labs, site of some of the greatest advances in science, where he tries to develop a bold new way to study the building blocks of matter, atoms. Just like insects, atoms usually move around very fast, making it almost impossible to examine them closely. But Steve thinks that if he can find a way to slow them down, he can open the door to new discoveries. The key turns out to be making the atoms very, very cold. that slows them way down.
And when they're moving around so slowly, even very feeble, minute forces can control them. And that ended up being the major secret. First, get them cold. After you get them cold, then you can trap them.
Steve and his colleagues figure out a clever way to do this, using lasers. And their technique is soon applied to many fields in science. Biologists, for example, grab hold of DNA molecules to get a closer look at how they perform their crucial jobs in our bodies.
Professor Stephen Chu.
For their work on trapping atoms, Steve and two of his fellow physicists are awarded the 1997 Nobel Prize. For the Chu family, the astonishing success of the boy who was almost a high school dropout feels like a dream come true. Steve is now a professor of physics at Stanford University in California. But in the early 2000s, his insatiable curiosity is about to lead him in a radically new direction.
Yes, that's correct.
He finds himself thinking more and more about something that many of his scientific colleagues are saying, that the Earth's climate is growing dangerously warmer, and that it's happening so fast that our way of life could soon be in peril. Steve wonders if they are right.
I've said to myself, you know, I'm skeptical, but they may have something there. And after a few years, I began to think, if they're half right, it could be not so good. And that kind of led me in deeper and deeper to try to understand, what did we know?
Steve pores through the evidence and discovers that yes, the Earth is growing warmer, faster than at any time in human history. And it's because of us. For more than 2 centuries, we've been burning carbon-based fuels such as coal, gas, and oil. A process that releases carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, where, like a huge blanket, they trap heat. Steve realizes that his fellow scientists are right, that we need to switch over to sources of energy that don't emit those heat-trapping gases as fast as we can.
We know that we essentially have to go to zero carbon emissions, certainly by the end of this century, if there's a hope of containing the worst of the risks of climate change.
So Steve decides to make energy the new focus of his career. In 2004, he leaves Stanford to run a government research lab in Berkeley, where he spearheads work on new and more climate-friendly ways to produce energy. And then, one day in 2008, he receives an unexpected phone call from the office of Barack Obama, who's just been elected president.
I get this phone call that says, the president-elect would like to talk to you about a very important job. So I flew to Chicago, and in a floor rented in some office building, the president-elect comes in the room alone and says, a lot of people say that you should be my Secretary of Energy. The reason I'm doing this is because I care so deeply about it, number one, and number two, that the United States can lead the way to a solution to the energy and climate problem.
Under Steve's leadership, the Energy Department, for the first time, makes responding to climate change its top priority. During his 4 years in office, he encourages the development of electric cars, wind energy, and solar energy. And he recruits scientists all over the country to research new energy technologies.
We are in a race to develop those technologies the world will demand and want and buy, and so it's going to have much more profound influence on our lives going into the future. And I think we can rise to the challenge.
Steve's work in the government helps pave the way for a big increase in our use of alternative sources of energy. Today, he's once again working at Stanford.
Okay, any results?
Doing what he's always loved best, searching for new ways that science can make a difference in our lives.
And then you're assuming there are two motors, they're independent, and of course you can always fail. And so the secret of doing research is you have to be incredibly optimistic. So that's what science is. How do you pick yourself up from the ashes and start another day? If you can find a job that excites you every day for 40, 50 years, and then you can look back and see it actually had an impact, and you can look forward and say, I hope it never stops. What more could you want?